في مجال القانون من جامعة همبولدت الألمانية السيد كريستيان. فليتفضل ضيفنا الكريم لإلقاء كلمته، وهي التي بعنوان حوكمة الشركات واستقرار أسواق المال. فليتفضل.
Mr. President, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Japan, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to address this audience of the Financial Market Authority of the State of Kuwait. I think it's my role in this conference to add some theoretical aspects. So I will focusing not just on corporate governance, but on business ethics as well, as has been mentioned by the President in his address. Let me start with introducing you to the organization of the paper. I start with the history of international financial markets. Then I go into the role of bad governance structures. Then I introduce a methodological fundament. And then I will introduce institutions. Institutions are general rules together with their sanction mechanism. And I will make a distinction between formal institutions like statutory law and informal institutions. And then I come to the point of formal and informal institutions, that they are necessary but not sufficient prerequisites for good corporate governance. And then I'll introduce the role of business ethics. Let me come to the Let me come to the short history of international financial market crisis. It had been the minimum capital requirements for banks combined with dysfunctional financial reporting standards, especially the combination of minimum capital combined with the so-called fair value problem. This means we have two types of regulation of financial markets, but they do not fit together. If I'm calculating minimum capital in terms of financial reporting standards and apply the fair value standard, I come up with big oscillations of valuations. And then we have the governance problems. But here, I do not share the conventional view, just transferring corporate governance standards from overall business to corporate governance problems in financial markets. We have to distinguish the goals of shareholders and the moral hazard problem. With a big leverage in the financial market institutions, we have a massive moral hazard problem because we have an asymmetry between profits for the shareholders and losses being carried by creditors and, as we have seen, by the taxpayer. So we have distorted incentives for the shareholders. So when it comes to financial market institutions, we do not have primarily to protect shareholders from management, but it's the other way around. We have to protect creditors and investors, and they might be threatened by a collusion between management and shareholders. So the problem is a little bit different than the general view. And this leads to the second problem, overcoming management's risk averseness. So risk averseness is different for management and for shareholders, because shareholders, they have a portfolio and they can distribute the risk. This is not the case for managers. And to overcome this risk averseness of management in the financial market sector, we have compensation incentives, which I call perverse compensation incentives. So the shareholders are interested in giving incentives for managements to take high risks. That's just the other way around what we know from ordinary business. So international financial market crisis may be understood as a product of banking regulation, financial reporting standards, and governance problems. And here regulation comes into play. First, we have to regulate corporate governance, taking into account this specific moral hazard problem. And we have to invent a combination of internal corporate governance and regulation. So regulation and corporate governance in financial markets are two sides of one coin. Let me introduce my methodological fundament. This is called institutional economics and is going back to Coase, Williamson, North, and others. This new approach of economics is shifting the focus from the game are the markets, to the rules of the game. This is the framework. And many of us think the framework is just the legal framework, but I will tell you that we have a difference, as I mentioned before, between formal and informal rules, and they are called, together with their enforcement mechanism, institutions. What are examples of formal institutions? Legal rules of all kinds. And here we make a distinction between public ordering by the legislator, by the international community, for instance, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, and private ordering. And private ordering plays a major part in financial markets, especially when it comes to codes of conduct. So the legislators of codes of conduct are not public authorities, but the players of the market themselves. This is the reason why we call this private ordering. So you see, we have two different approaches now. We have the top-down approach with the public legislator, and we have the bottom-up approach with the financial market players developing their own rules for the game. What are the assumptions of institutional economics? We are faced with the problem of transaction cost. We are faced with the problem of incomplete information, with a problem of bounded rationality, and bounded rationality plays a major role in financial markets. We are studying this phenomenon now in so-called behavioral economics. So we combine social psychology and economics. And then we are confronted what we call opportunism. So I look to my own advantage, and I'm neglecting the benefits or the harm to others. This might be ex-ante opportunism when it comes to writing contracts and an asymmetry of information, or ex-post opportunism when I have a so-called relational contract, which is an incomplete contract, and I try to interpret this incomplete contract in my favor and harming the other part. And as I have mentioned, we have moral hazard as a product of opportunism and dysfunctional institutions. What are the relevant formal institutions in this field? Let me start with Basel III plus national regulation. So we have corporate governance issues with the Basel Banking Commission. And this Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has pointed to 4 issues when it comes to corporate governance. The board should be appropriately involved in improving the bank strategy, clear lines of responsibility, then compensation policies, and last not least, the risk generated by operations that lack transparency should be adequately be managed. And as I told you, this is a little bit too narrow, because when it comes to risk taking, we have this asymmetry between the shareholders on one side and managers on the other side. So Basel II and III are focusing on so-called sound corporate governance, and my position is the definition of sound corporate governance is too narrow. It doesn't go to the real problem. It excludes, which is essential, financial reporting standards. These financial reporting standards had been one of the sources of the crisis, especially when it comes to consolidation of the so-called special investment vehicles, the SIVs. And we had been confronted with collusion of management and auditors, as has been the case in the Enron case. And more, we have now legal rules on management compensation, which is especially a dense network of legal rules now in Germany. We have corporate governance codes. Corporate governance codes are formal rules, private ordering, but I tell you, they are not suitable for financial institutions. Who is developing these corporate governance codes? Not the affected creditors and investors, but managers together with shareholders. And then, when it comes to credit contracts, we have covenants to protect creditors' interest. But unfortunately, those covenants are not applicable for hybrid financial instruments. And it had been these hybrid financial instruments which has caused the crisis. We have informal institutions as well, so-called sound business practices. So you have standards in financial institutions. You defined what are sound business practices for you. But then we are confronted with a dilemma. Those individual sound business practices are being eroded by competitive pressure. So the problem of business ethics comes into play. And the core issue of business ethics may be defined as follows: how to behave morally according to sound business practices under conditions in which actors who do not act morally have a competitive advantage. If this is the case, you cannot really keep to your sound business practices. So we have a dilemma of formal and informal institutions. When we have formal institutions, for instance, a statutory law, we have to apply very broad legal definitions, and they are open to interpretation. So we have a discretion which may be exploited, what I've mentioned, by ex post opportunism. we have an incentive to extend the rules by means of interpretation. So this might be cured wholly or partially by intervention of regulatory authorities, but within the rule of law. Then we have a starting point, legal rules, the second point, to extend these legal rules by interpretation, then intervention of regulatory authorities, and then we have judicial review. So the law courts are then defining what has to be understood by these legal rules. So what comes into play? The reputation mechanism. For the first issue, we are building reputation by and for market players. For instance, Kuwait. This is one of the assets to build reputation for a financial market. And it's interesting to see this is a competitive advantage. So we have a competition of reputation building between various financial markets. This is more or less a public good. And then we have the next level. We have reputation building by private market players, by financial institutions. So each player then tries to build a reputation which is linked to the most valuable asset in financial markets, trust. So I try to invest into trust building, and this means to invest into a comparative advantage vis-à-vis other financial institutions. But then we have the economics of reputation. And the core of economics of reputation is the asymmetry between building and destroying reputation. It is very long-term endeavor to build reputation, but you may destroy reputation by one act. Knowing that, if you're building a reputation, you are very careful not to destroy reputation. If we would have an infinite game, the reputation mechanism would work perfectly. But do we have an infinite or finite game? Nobody knows. This is the central weakness of the reputation mechanism. And the second problem I've already mentioned is exploitation of moral behavior. If some financial institutions develop reputation and build up trust, and others have a comparative advantage, not sticking to the same standards, they can exploit those who are acting morally. This is another type of asymmetry. So I'm now introducing trust building. Trust building is an investment process. Trust building means we start by defining ethical goals. What should be the ethical standards? Then we have to ask the question, how to act under given restraints and given constraints. We know that our moral behavior may be exploited by others not acting morally. So we have a dilemma structure. We are confronted with losses if defection occurs. Let's imagine we have 10 players and 9 players are investing into trust. and one player is defecting, this one player may exploit the 9 others. That's again the central dilemma structure of business ethics. So the question is how to overcome this dilemma. I must confess, I've turned to business ethics only 14 years ago. Up to that time, I was engaged first in neoclassical economics, then in institutional economics, always combining that with legal science. But then I detected that we have a special investment process. And the main issue is reciprocal investment into joint welfare gains. If we have credible commitment of all 10 players to invest reciprocally into trust, all of the 10 players will win. That's an investment process. So they invest into credibility, and they are investing into keeping to their standards which they had made public. So we end up with a combination of private credible commitments and market regulation. So we are building reciprocally trust within the given legal framework, within the framework of informal institutions, and within the framework of regulation. How does regulation comes into play? Capital market access requirements. So the secret of regulation is you define who can participate in the market. You have the entrance key. And you may define the ethical standards which must be kept if players want to enter your markets. And then the second step is transparency and compliance. Let me give you an example. Management compensation. So I'm working now from April 1st last year for the Wittenberg Center for Global Ethics, which is a think tank in Germany being active in business ethics. And the starting point here is how to cope with loss of trust in financial institutions in Germany. So we are modest. We are starting with financial institutions of Germany. We are now moderating a process of German financial institutions by the Wittenberg Center to talk to them how to engage in credible commitments, how to define ethical foundations of management compensation. You see what is behind that practical endeavor? The idea of reciprocal investment into trust. And this process this dialogue has been managed by the Wittenberg Center of Global Ethics. What is the expected outcome? The expected outcome will be a paper. Credible commitment of German financial institutions in the field of management compensation. What do I have in mind? Clearly, a comparative advantage of the German financial market. But this might turn out to be an export product, a spillover effect. If this is successful in Germany, we then want to transfer this endeavor to the European level. Not only the European Union. Never forget, Europe is not just the European Union. We have a very interesting financial marketplace which is outside the European Union. That is the Swiss financial market. And then, if we are successful on that level, we may export this to other financial markets in the world. And I tell you, I'm here because I'm very interested in the development of the Kuwait financial market, because here we can introduce standards, rules, and credible commitments which are not yet standard in other competing financial markets. So let me come to the interface between regulation, corporate governance, and business ethics. The starting point is regulation, public ordering, complemented by private ordering, corporate governance codes for financial institutions, with all their difficulties I have been mentioning. And then the third step, informal rules, but they are only functioning together with private, credible commitment. I come to the end. What are the practical consequences? I call this lessons learned. We have an interplay between public ordering, private ordering, and private credible commitments. What are the central issues then? First, minimum capital requirements to reduce moral hazard problems, and the key issue in minimal capital requirements is how to deal with so-called hybrid capital, for instance, COCOS. And the Swiss financial market regulators are far ahead of the EU regulators now when it comes to taking into account hybrid capital for the sake of minimum capital requirements. And the second issue which has to be tackled is corporate governance, and within corporate governance, the central issue is management compensation to outlaw bad incentives. And you see, we have to form a coalition between public regulators, private lawmakers, and reciprocal private credible commitments of financial market institutions. Thank you very much.
نشكر السيد كيرشنر على هذه الكلمة التي احتوت على الكثير من الجوانب المتعلقة في دور الحوكمة في استقرار أسواق المال. والآن وقبل الانتقال إلى الجزء المخصص للجلسات الحوارية في هذه الندوة، ستكون هناك استراحة قصيرة مدتها 15 دقيقة على أن نعود لاستكمال جلسة